The land between continents. In the soft light of dawn, the waters of the Bosporus seem almost motionless, as though holding their breath between two great continents. To the west lies the rolling spine of Europe, its hills wrapped in the gentle haze of early morning. To the east stretches the long plateau of Anatolia, rising and falling like the rhythm of distant waves. And between them, in this narrow strait, where currents whisper against ancient stone, the story of a civilization took shape, one that would stand for more than 1,000 years, only to fade slowly, like the last glow of embers at the end of a long night. Before the Byzantine Empire became a name spoken with both admiration and melancholy, long ages of earlier worlds prepared the stage. The land itself, perched between seas and mountains, served as a crossroads long before emperors draped themselves in purple. Traders from the Aegean passed through its harbors, nomads from the steppe brushed against its northern borders, and kingdoms from the Near East rose and fell in the distance, sending tremors of influence across the terrain. The soil of this region held memories of Miletus and the Ionian philosophers of Troy, sung in ancient verse of Persian roads and Roman legions. The landscape was already thick with history when Byzantium first opened its gates to the winds of fate. The eastern Roman provinces, which would one day transform into Byzantium, formed a vast mosaic of climates and peoples. Egypt, with its silent grain fields stretching along the Nile, fed half the Mediterranean world. Syria shone with bustling cities, Antioch, Damascus, Emesa, where the fragrances of markets mixed with the chants of early Christian communities. Anatolia, rough and mountainous, protected the empire's heart, yet demanded careful watch over its rugged frontiers. And Thrace, cool and wind-swept, guarded the approach to the city that would become Constantinople. The Romans had inherited all this, shaping the region with their roads, their administrative order, and the long shadow of their authority. But as the centuries drifted toward the 4th century, pressure from the edges pressed inward. Germanic tribes knocked against the Danube. Sassanid Persia stirred in the east. Trade routes shifted. Internal disputes grew louder. And through it all, the city of Rome, ancient, weighty, and sacred, struggled to hold an empire whose center of gravity had already begun to move quietly eastward toward the shores of the Bosporus. Here, geography offered something rare. A peninsula sheltered by seawater on 3 sides formed a natural fortress. 2 harbors reached inward like open hands. From this point, one could watch both continents, sense the flow of ships moving north and south, and command the routes leading deeper into the interior of Asia Minor. Whoever held this place could speak to the world with confidence. It was here that the Emperor Constantine chose to build his new Rome. Long before Constantinople's triumphal arches and sacred basilicas rose from the ground, the small Greek colony of Byzantium stood on this site, a settlement founded according to legend, by a traveler following an oracle's cryptic guidance. It had already lived through sieges, alliances, and the turning of centuries. Yet its destiny waited quietly beneath its streets like a seed lying dormant beneath winter soil. When Constantine looked upon this land, he saw more than a city. He saw a refuge for the empire. He wished to preserve a place where the old structures of Roman power could find new strength. Rome itself was far from the threats that troubled the frontier, but it was also distant from the sources of vitality that now pulsed from the east. By contrast, the Bosporus was near the heart of trade, near the grain fields of Egypt, close to the armies of Anatolia, and positioned at the hinge of continents. It offered security, but more importantly, it offered possibility. Still, the transformation from Rome to Byzantium did not begin with Constantine alone. It began with centuries of slow shifts in culture, language, and faith. As Latin continued to echo through imperial courts, Greek murmured through the streets and markets. As Roman administrative habits shaped daily life, new Christian beliefs spread from home to home, monastery to monastery. The old world and the new met here, folding into each other, creating something neither wholly Roman nor entirely Greek, but a delicate blend of both. The landscape amplified this blend. If you imagine standing on a quiet hillside above the Marmara Sea in the early 4th century, you might hear ships moving lazily through the strait, carrying spices from the east or wool from the uplands of Thrace. You might hear the faint hum of prayers drifting from a chapel hidden inside a modest villa. And beyond these sounds, you might sense something broader, an empire tilting not abruptly but gradually toward a new capital that awaited its birth. The collapse of the Western Roman Empire in later centuries would make the Byzantines appear strong by comparison, but strength alone did not ensure survival. Rather, it was the land and its position, a place that invited both opportunity and envy, that helped the Eastern Romans endure. Yet this same geography also exposed them to relentless pressures, the kind that would eventually wear down even the most resilient of states. To the north lay the plains where Slavs and steppe peoples moved with quiet persistence. To the east towered the ridges where Armenian fortresses guarded narrow mountain passes, and beyond them spread the plateau where Persian armies once marched with banners fluttering under harsh sun. To the south, the deserts of Syria sheltered cities rich in culture but vulnerable to upheaval. To the west, across the shimmering Aegean, lay the restless world of the Balkans. Constantinople would rise in the center of all this, a jewel, a beacon, and eventually a prize. As dawn brightens over the future capital, the soft light glints off the smooth surface of the water, and one can almost sense the coming centuries. Fleets will gather here. Diplomats will cross these waters with scrolls of treaties. Scholars will translate ancient works in rooms where only the quiet scratching of their quills breaks the silence. Armies will encircle these walls, and emperors will peer anxiously across these same straits, wondering from which direction danger will come. The forces that will one day lead to Byzantium's collapse are already present in faint outlines: the vulnerability of its borders, the immense value of its capital, the weight of maintaining lands spread across vast terrain, and the delicate balance between cultures within its boundaries. But for now, in this opening moment, those shadows remain distant, barely formed. Here at the meeting place of worlds and empire is about to rise one that will fight not only to expand, but to endure. And as the morning light settles over the strait, the story begins its slow unfolding, leading us gently toward the founding of a new Rome by the sea. At the edge of this dawn, history takes a quiet breath. The first stones of Constantinople will be set into place. A new Rome by the sea. Morning settles gradually across the hills above the Bosporus, warming stone and sea with a soft golden glow. In the early 4th century, when Constantine first walked these slopes, the city of Byzantium was little more than a modest settlement resting atop a strategic peninsula. Fishermen hauled nets from quiet coves. Traders greeted the day with the same steady rhythms their ancestors had known for centuries. Yet as the emperor gazed across these waters, he saw not a provincial harbor, but the foundation of a reborn world. Here he believed the Roman Empire could gather its strength and step forward into a new age. Constantine's decision to build a new capital was shaped by exhaustion his own and that of the empire he inherited. Civil wars had fractured Roman unity. Borders strained under the movement of peoples. Old cities felt worn, their power diminished by distance or decay. Rome itself, ancient and venerable, carried centuries of prestige, but its narrow streets and distant position no longer matched the needs of an empire stretching from the Atlantic to Syria. A new center was required, one that looked outward, not backward. The site of Byzantium offered a quiet promise. Its harbors could shelter fleets essential to controlling the Mediterranean and the Black Sea. Its hills allowed a defensive wall to rise naturally with the land, and its place on the narrow waterway gave the future emperor a rare vantage point, one from which he could watch the approach of allies and enemies alike. Geography, that silent architect of empires, favored this place more than any other. And so in the year 324, Constantine began the transformation. The ancient colony was expanded, its walls pushed outward to encircle new districts. Streets were laid with deliberate Roman order, stretching from the great forum toward the imperial palace and the rising silhouette of future basilicas. Workers from across the empire arrived, stonemasons from the Aegean islands, carpenters from the Balkans, skilled artisans from Antioch and Alexandria. Their hammers echoed across the water, marking each day of progress with steady, patient rhythm. As the city grew, it did so with symbols drawn from both past and future. The emperor wished for continuity, an unbroken thread tying his new city to Rome's ancient authority. Statues from older cities were brought here, set in public squares to whisper fragments of imperial memory. But he also desired a place shaped by new priorities, one rooted in the Christian faith that had grown steadily in the East. And so churches stood beside pagan monuments, each representing layers of changing identity. The city did not reject the old world. It enfolded it, creating a space where transition felt natural, even gentle. Constantinople, once finished, stood not as a rival to Rome, but as its reflection, its heir, its continuation. Yet slowly, quietly, it would surpass the old capital in influence. For here administration began to shift eastward. Here the emperor's court set new expectations for ceremony and governance. And here the empire would gather its remaining strength as the Western world sank into fragmentation. Imagine the sound of the city in these early decades, the clatter of hooves on stone as envoys from distant provinces approached the palace gates, the murmur of scholars walking beneath shaded colonnades, speaking of scripture and philosophy. The call of merchants from the harbor, their voices rising over the water as they beckoned to sailors unloading cargo from Cyprus, Egypt, and the shores of the Black Sea. Life in the new capital moved with purposeful calm like a river settling into its course. But beneath this calm change moved like an undercurrent. The creation of a new Rome altered the balance of power in ways that would echo through the centuries. Provincial elites from the East found themselves drawn into the orbit of the new court, where Greek language and Eastern customs held greater sway than they had in the old capital. Latin remained the language of the law, but Greek filled the streets, the markets, and the homes. Slowly, a transformation began, not through sudden decree, but through daily life. The empire remained Roman, yet its cultural center shifted, leaving behind the Mediterranean West and embracing the Eastern world. The empire's Christian identity also deepened here. Constantine's support for the faith encouraged the construction of new churches, their domes rising like quiet lanterns above the neighborhoods. Inside these sanctuaries, candles flickered against mosaic walls. Prayers drifted upward with incense. Pilgrims arrived from distant lands drawn by the promise of a capital where Christianity shaped not just private devotion, but public life. This spiritual foundation would become a defining feature of Byzantine identity, one that provided unity in moments of crisis and tension in moments of disagreement. As the city settled into its role as the empire's new heart, the contours of future triumphs and struggles began to emerge. Constantinople's wealth would attract traders and artisans, but it would also invite envy from foreign powers. Its strategic position would allow emperors to control vital sea routes, yet it would also make the city a prize for any ambitious conqueror. The walls rising along the land and sea offered security, but they could not silence the distant echoes of conflicts forming beyond the horizon. Still, in these early centuries, the empire felt renewed. The eastern provinces, wealthier, more urbanized, and less troubled by barbarian incursions than the west, provided a steady foundation. Grain continued to arrive from Egypt, textiles from Syria, metals from Anatolia. The court employed scribes, judges, administrators, and scholars, weaving a complex system of governance that would endure long after the Western Empire had faded. From the vantage point of Constantinople's upper terraces, an emperor could watch the shifting movements of empire and feel a quiet sense of control. The sea guarded him to the north and south. Fortresses lined the roads leading inland, and diplomatic envoys arrived daily offering alliances or requesting aid. Yet this sense of security would prove fragile, for even as the East flourished, forces beyond its borders grew restless. To the north, new confederations of tribes explored the river routes that led southward. To the east, Sassanid Persia remained a persistent rival, its rulers watching Constantinople with wary attention. To the south, deserts and trading towns saw changes that would eventually reshape the map of the Near East. The empire's future, though promising, rested on a delicate balance, one that required constant vigilance. But for now, in the early years of Constantinople's rise, the world felt full of possibility. The empire had not yet fractured under religious disputes or military crises. Anatolia was still firmly under Byzantine control. Syria and Egypt still filled the treasury's coffers. And Constantinople shone like a city newly awakened, its streets lively, its palace resplendent, its harbors humming with layers of quiet expectation. As twilight falls over this young capital, its lamps flicker to life, reflecting softly on the waves. The city seems to breathe in and out steady and confident. It does not yet know the storms that will one day shake its foundations. It simply stands poised between past and future, ready to guide the empire into its next chapter. The institutions that shaped Byzantine identity and preserved it through crisis begin to take form, shaping an empire of many peoples. Evening settles softly over Constantinople, casting long shadows across its newly built streets. Lamps glow behind latticed windows, and from the harbor, the sound of water brushing against wooden hulls drifts gently toward the heart of the city. Byzantium, still young as an imperial capital, now begins to shape the institutions that will define its character for centuries. What was once simply the eastern half of Rome slowly becomes something distinct, a civilization layered with Greek language, Roman law, and Christian faith, bound together by the quiet discipline of administration and the resilience of its people. In these early generations after Constantine, the empire's identity does not change abruptly. Instead, it shifts gradually, like the slow turning of a great river. Latin still echoes through the imperial court, but Greek hums softly in the streets. Roman traditions guide governance, yet Eastern customs influence daily life. Christianity spreads through every quarter, transforming temples, homes, and public festivals. The empire watches itself becoming new, not through grand declarations, but through 1,000 small choices made by emperors, clergy, soldiers, and merchants. One of the most important developments during this period is the steady strengthening of Byzantine administration. Rome had always relied on complex systems of governance, but Constantinople, closer to the empire's wealthiest provinces and more sheltered from Western turmoil, became a place where bureaucracy flourished. From quiet candlelit rooms inside the Great Palace, officials worked long hours sorting petitions, tracking taxes, and sending dispatches to provincial governors. These scribes and ministers, often unnoticed by the people, formed the backbone of a state that would withstand wars, plagues, and invasions that might have shattered less organized realms. Across the empire, governors enforced imperial law, commanders supervised frontier defenses, and tax collectors ensured the treasury remained full. And beneath them, local leaders carried out the daily tasks of keeping cities orderly and rural lands productive. Byzantine rule was firm but adaptable, designed to endure disruptions without breaking apart entirely. This flexibility would become essential, for the storms gathering around the empire would soon test its capacity to survive. Religion, too, began shaping the Byzantine world. Christianity was no longer an underground movement or a persecuted minority. It had become the empire's spiritual core. Churches rose across the provinces, their domes and mosaics reflecting new artistic visions. Pilgrims traveled along dusty roads to sites associated with saints, apostles, and martyrs. Monasteries grew in remote valleys and forested hills, where monks copied ancient manuscripts by lamplight, preserving Greek and Roman knowledge even as the wider world shifted. Yet, as Christianity grew, it also introduced new questions. What made a teaching orthodox or heretical? Who should define doctrine, the emperor, the bishops, or councils of scholars? These debates would soon stir tensions in cities from Alexandria to Antioch. For now, though, the empire still felt unified, its spiritual foundation becoming a source of strength and identity. Culturally, Byzantium was quietly forging a personality of its own. In the markets of Constantinople, merchants sold silks dyed in rich purples, bronze lamps shaped in Eastern styles, spices carried from the coasts of India, and icons painted with deep contemplative eyes. On the Hippodrome's racetrack, the factions, blues and greens, cheered their charioteers, their voices rising like a tide across the stone stands. In the law courts, advocates cited Roman legal precedents, their speech refined by Greek rhetoric. And in the imperial palace, emperors balanced tradition with transformation. They wore Roman titles, Augustus Caesar, yet their daily routine included ceremonies infused with Eastern symbolism. When they received foreign ambassadors, the audience halls shimmered with gold mosaics and intricate patterns projecting a sense of majesty designed to impress even the most distant rulers. Slowly, the empire began shaping something unique, a sense that its destiny lay not in replicating Rome, but in continuing Rome's legacy in a new form, one anchored in Constantinople and illuminated by Christian faith. Beyond the capital, however, life was often less serene. The frontiers demanded constant attention. To the east, the Sassanid Persians remained proud and powerful, matching the empire in wealth and military skill. Their monarchs claimed divine protection, and their armies marched with precision across the plains of Mesopotamia. The border between Byzantium and Persia was long and tense, stretching through deserts, mountains, and fortified cities that seemed to watch each other with steady, unblinking vigilance. To the north, migrating peoples shifted through the forests and grasslands beyond the Danube. Goths, Huns, and other tribes pressed toward the empire's borders in search of land security or opportunity. Some were welcomed as allies or settlers. Others entered by force, raiding frontier towns and challenging imperial authority. These northern pressures would eventually help reshape the entire Mediterranean world. And within the empire, social tensions simmered. Wealthy landowners gained influence, especially in Anatolia, where estates grew larger and more powerful. Urban populations demanded safety grain and employment. Provincial soldiers expected fair treatment and pay. Religious disagreements thickened, waiting for the day when they would erupt into open conflict. Yet despite all these pressures, the empire held together. Its administrative backbone remained strong, its culture was rich and adaptable, its capital was well defended, and its people carried within them a sense of belonging that transcended the challenges of the moment. They believed they were Romans' heirs to a civilization that had illuminated the world for centuries. But identity alone could not shield them from what lay ahead. In the mid-6th century, the reign of Justinian IV would bring dramatic change to the empire. His vision was bold, to restore Roman unity across the Mediterranean. Under his rule, Constantinople became a center of ambition and grand design. Legal reform, monumental construction, and renewed military campaigns reshaped the empire's path. Yet these triumphs came at immense cost, draining the treasury and stretching resources thin. Long before those events unfolded, the seeds were already being planted. Every reform, every new layer of administration, every cultural shift laid a foundation that would allow Byzantium to shine, then later struggle under the weight of its own complexity. For an empire is not simply built, it grows, evolves, and accumulates both strength and fragility over time. As the lamps of Constantinople flicker in the approaching night, the palace settles into quiet. Scribes roll up the day's records, priests extinguish candles in small chapels, merchants retire from their stalls, securing their goods behind wooden shutters. The city breathes evenly, unaware of the centuries that will rise and fall beyond its walls. In this moment of calm, the empire seems stable. It seems destined for endurance. But the forces shaping its identity, language, faith, administration, and shifting borders will in time play roles in both its resilience and its decline. For now, though, Byzantium stands firmly, an empire of many peoples, held together by the vision of its rulers and the quiet labor of its administrators. The transformation continues, guiding the empire toward its first major expansions and early rivalries, a journey that will soon reveal the pressures waiting along its vast frontiers. The winds of war will gather at the edges of the empire, setting the stage for the challenges that will define its early centuries. Winds of war and the edges of empire. The morning sun rises over the long frontiers of the Byzantine world, spreading pale light across fortresses and quiet villages, across forests, mountains, and deserts that form the empire's uneasy borders. These outer regions, often distant from Constantinople's marble courts and ceremonial splendor, were places where the empire's strength was constantly tested. Here the winds of war began their slow gathering, tugging at the edges of a realm that still imagined itself secure beneath heaven's protection. To understand why the empire would one day struggle to maintain its vast territory, one must step gently into these borderlands. For it was along these remote horizons that pressures accumulated sometimes, suddenly sometimes over generations, reshaping Byzantium's destiny and gradually eroding the foundations on which it rested. To the east, the empire confronted its most enduring rival, the Sassanid Persians. The border between the two great powers stretched across the rugged landscapes of Armenia and Mesopotamia regions, marked by steep ridges, river valleys, and fortified towns that had weathered centuries of conflict. Here armies moved with cautious discipline, their movements watched by scouts perched on lonely outposts. Though peace existed at times, it was often fragile, as though resting on a thin sheet of glass stretched across turbulent waters. Both empires possessed rich traditions and strong armies. Both claimed divine favor. Their clashes were not merely territorial disputes, but contests between worldviews, between deep-rooted civilizations that saw themselves as rightful leaders of the Near East. When war came, it usually arrived after months of careful maneuvering, ambassadors traveling with scrolls of demands, commanders gathering troops in dusty parade grounds, and border towns waiting nervously for signs of approaching armies. Even in moments of peace, the threat of conflict shaped Byzantine policy. Emperors stationed elite troops along the eastern frontier, invested heavily in fortresses, and sent governors' instructions crafted with meticulous precision. Taxes collected in distant cities eventually found their way into the coffers used to support eastern defenses. Though these efforts were necessary, they came at a price. Maintaining the frontier demanded constant resources, leaving less flexibility for challenges arising elsewhere. Meanwhile, in the northern Balkans, pressures of a different kind emerged. Beyond the Danube River, vast stretches of woodland and open plains, sheltered tribes in motion, Goths, Huns, Slavs, and other peoples whose paths crossed in unpredictable patterns. Sometimes they sought trade or refuge within imperial borders. At other times they pressed violently against the frontier, driven by hunger, opportunity, or fear of enemies behind them. When these groups interacted with the empire, the results were often mixed. Some were welcomed as foederati settlers and allies who agreed to provide military service in exchange for land and protection. Others proved less cooperative, raiding towns and disrupting trade along the river. And still others, particularly during moments of internal instability, forced their way deeper into imperial territory. From the vantage point of Constantinople, these movements might have seemed distant, yet their consequences rippled across the empire. Armies were diverted. Wealthy landowners fortified their estates. Farmers relocated or abandoned fields. Each disturbance added strain to an imperial system that depended on stable provincial life to sustain itself. Further west, in the Mediterranean basin, the empire also confronted familiar rivals. The Vandals in North Africa controlled important shipping lanes. The Visigoths in Spain and the Ostrogoths in Italy occupied lands once ruled directly from Rome. Though these territories no longer belonged to the empire, their presence shaped Byzantine ambitions, a quiet, persistent desire to reclaim lands once considered essential to the Roman world. As these tensions unfolded, new challenges emerged within the empire itself. The diversity of its peoples, Greeks, Armenians, Syrians, Copts, Slavs, and many others, brought cultural richness, but also occasional strain. Different regions held different religious traditions. Debates about Christian doctrine simmered, sometimes flaring into conflict. And while Constantinople shone as a beacon of authority and faith, provincial areas sometimes felt distant from the capital's grandeur. Their loyalty depended on effective administration and fair treatment. Despite these challenges, the Byzantine Empire in these early centuries remained remarkably resilient. Its capital's strategic position, its strong administrative system, and its cultural cohesion provided layers of protection. Emperors adapted their strategies as circumstances changed. Diplomacy, as much as war, served as a defining tool of Byzantine policy. Treaties were negotiated with precision, gifts and tributes shifted alliances, and the empire's famously sophisticated diplomats worked tirelessly to prevent small conflicts from becoming catastrophic. Yet even diplomacy could not prevent the storms gathering in the 7th century. A series of wars with Persia, longer and more draining than any before, pushed the empire to its limits. Armies marched repeatedly across Anatolia, leaving fields trampled and cities exhausted. Though Byzantium ultimately emerged victorious, largely through the daring leadership of Emperor Heraclius, the victory came at immense cost. Both empires were weakened, their treasuries depleted, their armies worn, and their people weary. Amid this exhaustion, a new force arose swiftly and unexpectedly from the Arabian Peninsula. The early Islamic conquests brought momentum unlike anything Byzantium had encountered. Armies moved with remarkable speed across Syria, Palestine, Egypt, and Persia, transforming the political landscape of the Near East. Byzantine forces, unable to recover from the long war with Persia, struggled to hold their ground. Ancient cities surrendered. Provinces essential for wealth and grain were lost. The empire did not collapse under this shock, but it changed profoundly. Its vast Mediterranean footprint shrank. Its cultural and political priorities shifted. New administrative structures emerged to adapt to smaller, more defensible borders. And in the process, the old imperial identity, Roman in name, universal in aspiration, evolved into something more distinctly Byzantine. Geography shaped this transformation. With the southern provinces gone, Constantinople and Anatolia became the empire's core. The sea protected the capital, mountains shielded the interior. The frontier lines moved closer, becoming clearer and more focused. From this narrower base, the empire would rebuild, though not without difficulty. Internal conflicts, economic strain, and religious disputes added to the weight of its challenges. Yet even as the empire struggled, its institutions, developed over centuries, helped it endure. Bureaucrats continued their work within the palace. Soldiers fortified strategic passes. Priests and monks tended to the spiritual needs of communities scattered across hills and valleys. And Constantinople itself, with its mighty walls and deep harbors, remained an anchor against the storms surrounding it. By the end of this turbulent period, the outlines of future decline were faint but visible. The empire had survived, but at great cost. Territories were lost, wealth diminished. Rival powers strengthened around its borders, and though Byzantium would recover in later centuries, these early pressures planted seeds that would eventually contribute to its long, slow collapse. As night falls across the empire's frontiers, the winds quiet. Torches flicker along distant walls. The vast landscape grows still, holding its breath between battles, migrations, and treaties yet to be written. The empire will attempt to reform, adapt, and reclaim its strength a story of resilience that reveals how Byzantium endured even as challenges continued to gather around it. The empire stands and reforms. After long years of war loss and upheaval, the Byzantine Empire found itself surrounded by silence. Not peace, but the silence that follows great strain when cities lie scorched and quiet, and the hum of empire becomes a whisper. The 7th century had brought disasters almost too great to bear the endless wars with Persia, the sudden rise of Islam, the fall of Egypt and Syria, the shrinking of a once vast world. And yet, the empire did not fall. It bent, it trembled, but it did not break. This was the beginning of a quieter kind of resilience, a survival born not of conquest, but of reform. For Byzantium, still watching the world from the stone terraces of Constantinople, knew it could no longer rule as it had before. It would have to change how it governed, how it defended itself, and how it imagined its place in the world. The man who guided Byzantium through much of this transformation was Emperor Heraclius, who ruled from 610 to 641. Though remembered for military victories and crushing defeats, his deeper legacy was adaptation. During his reign, the empire began to shed the last layers of the old Roman world. Latin faded almost completely from administration. Greek became the official language of the court and of imperial edicts. This shift had been coming for generations, but now it settled firmly into place. More than a change in tongue, this marked a change in spirit. Byzantium no longer tried to mirror the empire of Augustus or Trajan. It became something of its own, an Eastern Christian empire, smaller but deeply rooted, resilient, and pragmatic. One of the most important reforms came in how the empire defended itself. After the loss of rich provinces like Egypt and Syria, the treasury could no longer support a sprawling professional army stationed across vast territories. The old system was unsustainable. In its place, a new structure emerged, the themata, or themes. Under this system, the empire was divided into regional military zones. Soldiers were no longer concentrated in distant outposts, but settled on land within these themes. In exchange for military service, they received small plots to farm. Their lives became woven into the countryside they were sworn to protect. When danger arose, they defended not just the empire, they defended their homes, their fields, their churches. This arrangement was not merely economic, it was cultural. The themes created a deeper bond between soldier and state. Across Anatolia, where rocky hills rose over olive groves and vineyards, villages began to reflect this new structure. Local leaders emerged, often linked to the military. Orders from Constantinople traveled through more focused channels. The army was no longer distant, it was local. And for a time this helped Byzantium endure. The transformation extended beyond the military. The church, which had already grown in influence, became an even more central pillar of Byzantine life. As borders contracted, the faith expanded, filling the cultural space left behind by lost cities and lands. Monasteries multiplied, clinging to lonely hillsides and wooded slopes, offering refuge for learning and prayer. Bishops took on roles that reached beyond the pulpit, caring for the poor, organizing defense, and even mediating between local authorities and the imperial court. Art and architecture shifted too. The grandeur of earlier imperial projects gave way to simpler, more introspective forms. Icons painted images of Christ, the Virgin Mary, and the saints became central to devotion. These were not mere decorations, but sacred windows meant to bridge the earthly and the divine. In the candlelit corners of chapels and homes, these icons watched over the faithful, offering comfort and constancy in a world of change. Yet not all welcome the power of images. In the early 8th century, a great storm broke across the empire, not of swords and sieges, but of theology. The iconoclastic controversy began under Emperor Leo III, who issued a decree banning the veneration of icons. He and his supporters feared that these images had become idols, distractions from true worship. Across the empire, icons were removed from churches, sometimes destroyed. Monasteries protested. Riots broke out. The empire became divided not just between East and West, but within itself. This internal struggle would last more than a century, with emperors, patriarchs, monks, and citizens each taking sides. It was not only a religious debate, it was political, regional, and social. It revealed fault lines within Byzantium between the rural and the urban, the military and the monastic, the central authority and the provinces. The resolution came slowly with the eventual restoration of icons in 843, an event still commemorated in Orthodox liturgy as the triumph of orthodoxy. By then the empire had weathered another storm, the Arab sieges of Constantinople. Twice in 674-678, and again in 717 to 718, the great capital stood under threat from vast fleets and armies. But its walls, its defenders, and its natural position held. So too did the ingenuity of Byzantine technology, most famously Greek, fire a mysterious incendiary substance that clung to ships and soldiers alike, burning even on water. Its secret recipe was closely guarded, and its use helped save the city in moments of dire peril. Through all this, the reforms, the theological crises, the wars, the empire emerged, changed. It was poorer than before, more regional, and far more insular. But it had also become leaner, harder to kill. Byzantium could no longer dominate the world stage, but it had become a survivor. Its strength lay not in expansion, but in endurance. Daily life during this period reflected that endurance. In the countryside, farmers sowed their seeds beside old battlefields, hoping for seasons of peace. In the cities, artisans shaped icons and incense burners, their hands, guided by tradition, passed down in whispers. In the monasteries, scribes copied not just scripture, but Homer and Plato, preserving ancient knowledge that would have vanished without them. And in Constantinople, the palace continued its solemn rhythms. Emperors walked marble halls where the scent of olive oil lamps filled the air. Courtiers debated matters of law and diplomacy. Outside the palace gates, the city still bustled with life. Its market sold wine, honey, and wax. Its ships set sail from the Golden Horn, carrying goods across a Mediterranean that, though less Roman than before, still beat with the pulse of trade. Though Byzantium had lost much, it had also found a kind of equilibrium, a way to survive between greater powers, to adapt rather than shatter. This was not a golden age, but a time of quiet recalibration, of survival without triumph. And yet, in the long history of empires, that kind of endurance is rare. Night falls once more over the Bosporus, the sea calm and reflective. In the distance, the walls of Constantinople stand tall and silent. They have held through war, siege, and plague. And behind them, a smaller, humbler empire breathes steadily, preparing slowly, patiently, for a future that will one day shine again. We begin to feel the first warmth of revival, the early steps toward a new cultural and political flourishing, the hints of a golden age to come. A dawn before the golden age. The long night of crisis slowly loosened its grip on the Byzantine Empire. After centuries of war loss and internal struggle, a subtle change began to stir across the land. It did not arrive with the sound of trumpets or the proclamation of victory, but with the quiet resilience of ordinary life, returning to places once marked by danger. Fields were cultivated again, roads were repaired, cities that had shrunk during the hardest years breathed more steadily. In these small movements, like the first rays of sunlight creeping over the horizon, the empire sensed the beginning of renewal. By the middle of the 9th century, Byzantium had weathered the worst of its early medieval storms. The Arab conquests had long since reshaped its borders, but the empire's core in Anatolia and the Balkans remained intact. The iconoclastic controversy had ended, allowing the Church to heal and the spiritual life of the empire to knit itself together again. The themes, though not perfect, provided a workable military and administrative structure. Slowly, stability returned. It was during this period that the empire entered what historians later called the Macedonian Renaissance, a time not only of cultural revival, but of quiet confidence after generations of fear and uncertainty. The path to this renewal began with a single man of humble origin, Basil the founder of the Macedonian dynasty. Basil rose from obscurity to the imperial throne in a story that reads almost like a gentle legend, told beside a hearth, a gifted horseman, a servant in the palace, a man whose skill and charisma carried him upward through the layers of court life. Under his rule, the empire regained a sense of direction, yet the renewal was not solely the work of emperors. Sometimes it happened in the quietest corners of Byzantine life. In remote monasteries perched on rocky slopes, monks continued their steady labor of copying old manuscripts. Their quills scratched softly across parchment, preserving the teachings of Aristotle, the histories of Thucydides, the poems of Homer, and the works of the early church fathers. Without their diligence carried out in silence day after day, so much of the ancient world might have faded into oblivion. Instead, Byzantium became the bridge by which classical knowledge survived into later ages. In cities, artisans shaped icons with renewed devotion. After the end of iconoclasm, the empire experienced a flowering of sacred art. Icon painters worked with deep blues, warm gold leaf, and ghostly whites, trying to capture not physical realism, but the quiet presence of the divine. Their brush strokes were slow, deliberate, almost meditative. And in the dim interior of churches where candles flickered and shadows danced across the walls, these images seemed to breathe with spiritual life. The empire also experienced a resurgence in law and administration. Basil the Wine and his successors oversaw the creation of new legal codes that organized earlier Roman laws into clearer, more accessible structures. The work of scholars like Leo the philosopher contributed to this revival. Universities and schools in Constantinople expanded their influence, drawing students eager to study rhetoric, theology, science, and philosophy. Even in difficult times, the Byzantine commitment to learning had never disappeared. Now it blossomed again. Trade, too, revived. Merchants traveled the old routes across Anatolia, carrying goods toward the capital. Ships moved through the Aegean and the Black Sea, bringing grain, wine pottery, silk, and furs. Markets that had once felt empty grew lively once more. If you stood in one of those markets at midday, you might hear Greek mingling with Armenian, Slavic, Arabic, and Latin voices from every direction, meeting under the warm sun. But the renewal was not simply cultural or economic. It affected the very mood of the empire. After generations of narrow survival, people began to imagine growth again. The empire slowly reasserted control over lost lands. In the Balkans, Byzantine armies pushed back against Slavic and Bulgarian incursions. In the east, the military regained confidence, launching cautious campaigns into regions once thought irretrievable. This growing strength culminated in the reigns of powerful emperors like Nikephoros Phocas and John Tzimiskes, whose disciplined armies pushed into Syria and reclaimed important fortresses. These victories did more than expand territory. They restored pride. They allowed the empire to think of itself not merely as a survivor, but as a force capable of shaping its destiny. Yet beneath this outward recovery lay subtler shifts that would later influence the empire's decline. The thematic system, once nimble and efficient, began to evolve as military needs changed. Armies grew more professional again, less dependent on local soldier farmers. Elite families, especially in Anatolia, gathered wealth and influence, gaining control over large estates. These magnates would later challenge imperial authority, weakening the very structures that had saved the empire during its darkest moments. For the time being, however, these tensions remained quiet. The empire continued its ascent, guided by a series of capable rulers and enriched by the cultural rebirth unfolding within its walls. Constantinople, above all, shone with renewed brilliance. If you wandered its streets during this age, you would witness a city fully alive. The Hagia Sophia, with its great dome rising like a celestial sphere above the skyline, welcomed worshippers into its luminous interior. Light filtered through its windows as though descending gently from heaven itself. The sound of chanting filled the vast space, echoing through the arches until it felt like a tidal current of devotion. Outside the sacred halls, the city pulsed with the rhythms of daily life. The hippodrome still hosted races, its crowds roaring with excitement as chariots carved tight loops around the spina. The great palace housed a labyrinth of courtyards, ceremonial halls, libraries, and gardens scented by jasmine and rosemary. Imperial processions moved through these spaces with dignified splendor, robes of deep purple jeweled crowns that glimmered in torchlight, and banners that swayed softly in the breeze. Diplomats from distant kingdoms visited the capital, marveling at its wealth and sophistication. Many left with the impression that Constantinople was not merely a city, but a world unto itself, an island of stability in a sea of shifting powers. This reputation served the empire well. Diplomacy became one of its greatest tools. Byzantium played enemies against one another, forged temporary alliances, and used its prestige to avoid wars it could not afford. Even so, the empire's resurgence was not permanent. Beneath the glow of this early Renaissance strain, still gathered in quiet places, the aristocracy grew stronger, court politics grew more intricate. The economy, though revived, remained vulnerable to disruptions in trade, and the empire's reliance on strong emperors meant that a single weak ruler could undo decades of careful progress. But those troubles lay beyond the horizon, for now the empire glided through an era of restoration, an age in which its wounds began to heal, its institutions strengthened, and its culture blossomed like a field waking after winter. As twilight falls on this chapter of Byzantine history, the soft hum of Constantinople settles into the night. Lamps flicker in the upper stories of merchants' houses. Monks in distant monasteries continue their patient work. Soldiers keep quiet watch along the frontiers, their cloaks rustling gently in the cold wind. And across the empire, people sense that a better age has begun. That growing dawn will soon brighten into full day. The golden age of Byzantine civilization, the height of its majesty, learning, art, and power. The age of purple and gold. The sun rises gently over Constantinople, casting warm light across tiled rooftops and gilded domes. In this era, spanning the 10th and early 11th centuries, the Byzantine Empire stands at the height of its majesty. It is a world woven from purple and gold, from silk and incense, from chants echoing beneath great arches, and from armies marching with quiet discipline across distant fields. This is Byzantium's classical age, the moment when its culture, politics, and military strength all converge into a luminous display of power and refinement. If earlier centuries were marked by survival, these are marked by triumph. The scars of the past remain faint reminders of loss and resilience, but the empire has learned to work with them, shaping hardship into wisdom and wisdom into strength. In the heart of the capital, the Hagia Sophia rises above all its dome, catching the morning light like a suspended sun. Inside, the air smells of warm beeswax and incense. Mosaics shimmer on curved walls, their golden tesserae reflecting candlelight with a soft radiance that seems to hover between heaven and earth. The rhythmic chanting of clergy fills the space with a solemn beauty, flowing across the marble floor like a tide. This is not merely a cathedral, it is the living soul of the empire, a symbol of the cosmic order Byzantium believes it upholds. Nearby, the great palace complex stretches across the shoreline, an intricate maze of reception halls, gardens, chapels, and administrative wings. In these rooms, the emperors of the Macedonian dynasty exercise their authority with deliberate calm. They preside over ceremonies in robes dyed in the deep purple reserved for imperial blood. They issue commands that ripple across provinces and frontiers, and they host ambassadors who arrive bearing gifts from distant realms, Slavic princes, Arab envoys, Scandinavian traders, Armenian lords. Each visitor leaves with the memory of a capital unlike anything they have ever seen. One of the era's most distinguished rulers is Constantine VII, Porphyrogenitus, whose name, born in the purple, evokes the symbolic richness of Byzantine legitimacy. A scholar-emperor, he fills the palace with book scholars and scribes. Under his guidance, historical chronicles, military manuals, and works of political advice are compiled with meticulous care. His own writings, such as De Administrando Imperio, blend practical instruction with a sense of inherited responsibility, offering a glimpse into the mind of a ruler who sees governance as both science and sacred trust. His reign, along with those of his successors, marks a flourishing of learning now remembered as the Macedonian Renaissance. Schools in Constantinople attract students from across the empire. Monasteries continue to preserve ancient texts. Scholars refine the Greek language, compose new works, and study the philosophies of earlier ages. It is a world where knowledge is not a luxury, but a cherished foundation of imperial identity. Art also reaches new heights. Icon painters explore deeper expressions of the sacred, developing a style that balances human tenderness with spiritual solemnity. Mosaics in newly restored churches glisten with vibrant blues and radiant golds. Stone carvers shape marble columns with intricate patterns inspired by both classical forms and Eastern influences. The visual language of Byzantium becomes unmistakable, refined, symbolic, luminous. Beyond the capital, the empire expands militarily under emperors like Nikephoros, Phocas, John Zimisces, and Basil II. Nikephoros Phocas, a stern and ascetic general, leads disciplined armies into eastern frontier lands long held by Muslim rulers. His campaigns reclaim fortresses in Cilicia and northern Syria, pushing the empire's borders forward with steady determination. He strengthens the army, fortifies strategic towns, and supports monastic foundations across Anatolia. John Zimisces, equally skilled, advances further into Mesopotamia, consolidating the empire's newfound strength. His rule blends military vigor with diplomatic finesse, extending Byzantine influence into Armenia and beyond. But it is under Basil II, known to later generations as the Bulgar Slayer, that Byzantium reaches its military zenith. His reign is long, disciplined, and relentless. He reforms the army, asserts firm control over the aristocracy, and conducts campaigns with a patience that mirrors the empire's own long endurance. His eventual victory over the Bulgarian Empire in the early 11th century reunites large portions of the Balkans with Byzantium. Under Basil II, the empire's frontiers feel more secure than they have in centuries. Despite the martial achievements, life within the empire remains gentle for most. Farmers in Anatolia cultivate wheat, olives, and grapes, their fields warmed by Mediterranean sun. Shepherds guide their flocks across green plateaus. Merchants move along old Roman roads, their caravans filled with textiles, spices, and precious metals. In towns, potters shape clay vessels, and metal workers forge tools and ornaments. The economy hums stable and diverse. There is also a subtle but pervasive spirituality in daily life. Icons hang above doorways. Priests walk narrow lanes to bless homes and fields. Bells ring to call the faithful to prayer. Families gather for feast days, marked by hymns, incense, and communal meals that blend the sacred with the familiar rituals of home. But even during an age of prosperity, shadows begin to lengthen, barely visible yet present. The very victories that strengthen the empire also introduce new strains. The aristocracy grows more powerful, especially in Anatolia, where successful military families accumulate extensive estates. Their wealth gives them influence, and influence brings political ambition. Over time, this will weaken the delicate balance between central authority and regional power. Additionally, the professionalization of the army, while effective for expansion, gradually erodes the thematic system that once tied soldiers to their land. The empire becomes more reliant on elite troops and mercenaries. Foreign warriors, Varangians from the north, Armenians from the east, join the imperial ranks. Though loyal for now, their presence hints at a future in which Byzantium will depend too heavily on external strength. And while trade flourishes, it also invites competition. Italian merchant cities like Venice, Amalfi, and Genoa gain influence in Byzantine harbors. Their ships move quickly. Their networks stretch across the Mediterranean. For the moment, they serve as partners, but they will later become rivals whose economic privileges quietly undermine Byzantine control. Yet none of these shadows dominate the present moment. They are small fissures beneath a polished surface, detectable only in hindsight. To the people living in this golden age, the empire appears secure, blessed, and radiant. As dusk falls over Constantinople, the city glows with soft firelight. Lanterns illuminate the markets. Torches flicker along the shoreline. The sound of evening prayer drifts from churches dissolving into the night air. Across the empire, from the quiet vineyards of Thrace to the monasteries of Cappadocia, people feel a sense of continuity, as though Byzantium, after so many hardships, has found harmony at last. This is the height of Byzantine civilization, a world of precision and devotion, of shimmering mosaics and disciplined armies of emperors who imagine themselves guardians of a divine order. But even at noon, the longest shadows begin to form. We will watch those shadows lengthen slowly, almost imperceptibly, as new pressures rise within and beyond the empire's borders. Shadows, gathering at noonday. The sun stands high over Constantinople, bright and unwavering, as though the empire beneath it could shine forever. The streets are busy, the markets lively, the harbors full. Scholars debate in shaded courtyards, while soldiers in polished armor stand guard at palace gates. From the outside, all seems solid and serene. Byzantium, after centuries of struggle, appears once again at the center of a flourishing world. And yet, beneath this warm and brilliant surface, shadows slowly begin to gather. They do not fall suddenly or with alarm. They drift in quietly, almost politely, settling at the edges of society, along the distant borders, and in the silent rooms of aristocratic estates. They are the shadows of complacency, imbalance, and shifting power, subtle forces that over time will do what enemy armies could not. The first of these shadows takes shape in the countryside of Anatolia, where the empire's military strength has long been rooted. For generations, the theme system allowed soldier farmers to defend their land and serve the state with loyalty, born from familiarity. Their villages, positioned along strategic frontiers, provided a buffer against invasion and a reliable source of manpower. But now, in the height of the empire's golden age, something begins to change. The great aristocratic families, descendants of generals, provincial governors, and landed magnates, start expanding their estates. Their wealth allows them to buy up small farms from soldiers struggling with debt or drought. Bit by bit, the empire's countryside begins to pass from the hands of independent farmer soldiers into the possession of powerful clans. To a traveler moving through Anatolia at this time, the change might feel subtle. A larger estate here, a new manor house there. Harvests carried not by the soldier who worked the land, but by tenants who owed rent to distant landlords. Yet these quiet transformations steadily erode the system that once helped Byzantium survive its darkest days. When peasant soldiers lose their land, they also lose their place in the army. And when estates grow too large, the balance between the state and the aristocracy begins to shift. Emperors attempt reforms. Laws are written to limit land accumulation. Investigators are sent to enforce them. But the great families have influenced friends at court, loyal retainers, hidden debts owed to them. Legislation proves difficult to enforce, and the countryside continues to slip away from imperial control. A second shadow forms along the empire's borders. Though Basil II's victories secured the Balkans and expanded Byzantine influence, these frontiers remain restless. New groups appear on the horizon: Pechenegs, Uzes, and Cumans, nomadic peoples who move swiftly across the plains north of the Danube. Their presence forces Byzantine generals to remain vigilant, diverting troops and resources that might have been used elsewhere. In the West, the rising powers of Europe begin to look toward the wealthy East with curiosity. The German emperors, ambitious and proud, send envoys seeking recognition and alliance. Venice, once a loyal trading partner, grows more confident, its merchant fleets multiplying, its appetite for commercial privileges expanding. Over time, these relationships will turn from cooperation to rivalry. To the east, even greater changes are underway. The fragmented Muslim states of earlier centuries begin to consolidate. New dynasties rise, new ambitions awaken. Turkish tribes recently arrived from the deeper reaches of Central Asia begin moving into the frontiers of the Islamic world. They serve as mercenaries, settle in borderlands, and gradually form small principalities. They are not yet united, nor do they yet threaten the heart of Byzantium, but their presence will reshape the empire's future in ways not yet imaginable. A third shadow forms within the empire's own walls, the quiet, weighty pressure of bureaucracy and ceremony. The Byzantine state, refined through centuries of reform and tradition, becomes increasingly intricate. Court hierarchy grows more elaborate. Titles multiply. Officials, while often well-trained, sometimes become more devoted to process than to problem-solving. Decisions slow as they move through layers of protocol. None of this weakens the empire immediately. In fact, some of these systems help maintain order and preserve Byzantine culture. But the growing complexity of the palace, its rituals, competitions, and factions creates an environment where political maneuvering begins to overshadow pragmatic governance. When emperors are strong, the system functions smoothly. When they are weak, delays and internal disputes magnify every crisis. The passing of Basil II marks another turning point. Though revered for his discipline and strength, he leaves no heir. His death opens the door to succession struggles, court intrigues, and rulers less capable of restraining the aristocracy or balancing the empire's institutions. Power begins to drift, not dramatically, but gradually like sand, shifting beneath a seemingly solid foundation. Economically, two currents of change move quietly through the empire. Trade flourishes, but much of it now depends on Italian merchants. Venetian and Genoese ships, lighter and faster than their Byzantine counterparts, dominate maritime routes. In exchange for services against pirates and enemies, these Italian cities negotiate privileges, reduce taxes, special quarters in Constantinople, exemptions from local laws. At first, these seem harmless, but over time, they erode the empire's commercial autonomy. If you walk through the harbor district of Constantinople during this period, you might notice entire wharves humming with Venetian activity. Shipbuilders, merchants, and brokers, all working under the lion banner of St. Mark. Goods flow through their hands, profits accumulate in their coffers, and Byzantine influence over its own trade begins to slip. And yet for most people living in this era, the empire still feels stable. The churches are full, the markets overflow with goods, the palace gleams with gold and ceremony, armies stand ready, well-equipped and confident. Life on the surface seems prosperous and secure. That is the quiet danger of a golden age. Its brilliance can conceal the cracks forming beneath. Byzantine chroniclers of the time do not describe impending doom. How could they? The empire of their day appears strong. The walls of Constantinople remain unbroken. The Balkans are under firm control. Anatolia, though changing, still forms a reliable heartland. And the empire's culture, its art laws and theology, continues to flourish. But history often turns not on the obvious, but on the subtle. The rise of great estates, the empowerment of the aristocracy, the weakening of small landholders, the growing influence of foreign merchants, each of these shifts adds weight to the scales. They are not crises by themselves. They are quiet transitions that in time make the empire less flexible, less resilient, less able to respond to sudden change. As evening settles over Constantinople, the city continues its serene routine. Lanterns glow along the colonnades. Courtiers whisper in palace corridors. Monks chant softly in distant chapels. Everything feels timeless, as though the empire could stand untouched for centuries more. But the shadows lengthening at noonday will soon grow darker. A great crisis approaches, the kind that arrives not with whispers, but with the sudden collapse of certainty. A battle is coming, a turning point, a moment after which Byzantium will never again be the same. The Cataclysm of Manzikert. The late summer sun hangs low over the Anatolian plateau, its light diffused by a soft haze that blurs the distant hills. The land lies quiet, open stretches of dry grass, scattered villages, and ruins of ancient roads that twist gently toward the east. For centuries, this region has formed the protective heart of the Byzantine Empire. Its mountains and valleys have shielded Constantinople from invasions, feeding the empire with grain horses and soldiers. But now, in the 11th century, a quiet unease settles across this landscape. The old balance is shifting. A new power has begun to test the eastern frontier, the Seljuk Turks, a confederation of tribes whose horsemen glide across the plains with astonishing speed. They do not yet seek empire in the grand Byzantine sense. They move with the flexibility of nomads, establishing footholds where they can, probing weaknesses where they appear. Still, their presence is unmistakable, and their momentum grows with each passing year. For the Byzantines, the situation is complicated not only by this new external threat, but by internal fragility. The decades after Basil II's death left the empire without the firm leadership it once enjoyed. Court factions competed for influence. Civil wars erupted between rival generals. The aristocracy tightened its grip over the countryside, taxes faltered, discipline slipped, and across Anatolia, the empire's vital heartland, local defenses weakened, allowing Seljuk raiders to push deeper into lands once securely held. When the Emperor Romanos IV Diogenes ascends to the throne, he inherits an empire still outwardly powerful, but hollowed in quiet places. Romanos is a soldier at heart, stern and determined. He believes the empire can withstand the Turkish threat if it acts boldly. Reclaiming Anatolia becomes his mission, one he pursues with urgency, for he knows that each year of delay allows the frontier to crumble further. And so, in the summer of 1071, he marches east with a great army. Imagine the sight of that force stretching across the plains' banners, fluttering in the hot wind armor, glinting under the sun, the rhythmic sound of hooves and marching feet echoing across the hills. It is a vast army, but one that reflects Byzantium's fractured state. Alongside the imperial troops march Armenian contingents, Frankish mercenaries, Norman knights, Pecheneg horsemen, and others hired from distant lands. Their loyalty varies, their goals diverge, their unity is uncertain. Still, Romanos hopes that strength of numbers will restore Byzantine authority in the east. The Seljuk Sultan Alp Arslan does not initially seek a decisive battle. He is occupied with campaigns in Syria when he learns of the emperor's approach. But recognizing the danger of allowing such a large Byzantine force to move unopposed, he turns north with a swift army of skilled horse archers fighters known for their speed, discipline, and mastery of hit-and-run tactics. Two worlds now move toward each other across the Anatolian plateau, an old empire marching in heavy formation, and a rising power gliding across the plains with quiet confidence. The meeting place is Manzikert, a fortress town near Lake Van, its stone walls overlooking a landscape of rolling hills and shimmering water. The air is warm, filled with the sound of insects and the rustle of dry grass. It is here, in this serene setting, that one of the most consequential events in Byzantine history unfolds. But the Battle of Manzikert is not a single dramatic clash. It is a slow unraveling. For days the two armies maneuver cautiously. Seljuk riders harass the Byzantine flanks, firing arrows before disappearing into the distance. Dust clouds rise behind them like faint ghosts. Romanos attempts to maintain order, but confusion spreads through the ranks. Miscommunication grows. Command structures, already weakened by internal rivalries, begin to fray. On the day of the battle, the Byzantine army advances under a harsh, bright sky. Romanos leads the center. The right wing moves forward steadily. The left contains troops whose loyalty to the emperor is uncertain. As the army approaches the Seljuk lines, Turkish horse archers ride in wide arcs, releasing arrows that fall like soft rain onto Byzantine shields. They retreat whenever the Byzantines attempt to engage, drawing them farther and farther from their starting point. Hours pass. The heat grows. Exhaustion sets in. Water supplies dwindle. As evening approaches, Romanos realizes the danger of being too far from camp. He orders a measured retreat, a difficult maneuver, even for a unified army. But Byzantium in this era is not unified. The left wing, commanded by the ambitious general Andronikos Doukas, does not obey the emperor's signal. Whether through betrayal or caution, Doukas turns away from the battlefield and retreats entirely, taking his troops with him. Dust rises in the distance as his forces disappear. Romanos, unaware of the full situation, attempts to pull back the center. At that moment, Alp Arslan launches a swift counterattack. Seljuk riders, who had spent the day feigning retreat, now sweep in from all sides. Confusion spreads through the Byzantine ranks. Signals are misunderstood. Units collide with one another in the fading light. A moment of hesitation becomes a cascade of disorder. There is no grand collapse, no dramatic rout. Instead, the Byzantine army dissolves slowly into chaos, encircled by an enemy that moves with effortless coordination. Romanos fights bravely, but is eventually captured, brought before Alp Arslan, not in triumph, but in weary acceptance of the day's outcome. The meeting between emperor and sultan is calm. Alp Arslan treats his prisoner with respect. He offers generous terms. The sultan does not seek to destroy Byzantium. He seeks stability on his border. Romanos accepts the conditions, envisioning a negotiated peace and a rebuilt frontier. But fate turns again. Byzantium, shaken by the defeat, plunges immediately into political crisis. Romanos is overthrown, blinded, and ultimately killed by rivals in the capital. The treaty he signed is ignored. With central authority broken, frontier defenses collapse entirely. The Seljuks, who had not originally sought to conquer Anatolia, now find the land open before them. Turkic tribes move gradually into the plateau, settling, farming, and building new centers of power. What Byzantium loses in the aftermath of Manzikert is not just a battle, it is Anatolia, the empire's heartland. Its villages, its soldiers, its grain fields, its strategic depth. Without it, the empire's strength will never fully recover. And yet, in the immediate moment after the battle, there is stillness. The winds across the hills carry no sense of the future. The landscape remains calm, the same as it was before the armies arrived. A shepherd might lead his flock across the plains without realizing that the fate of an empire has shifted. This is how great turning points often unfold, not with thunder, but with a soft, inexorable change that reveals itself only in hindsight. As night falls over Manzikert, the sky grows deep and quiet. Stars appear untouched by the events of the day. But Byzantium, though still standing, has entered a new era, one marked by vulnerability, internal division, and the long struggle to reclaim what was lost. The empire will attempt to recover. Emperors will reform, rebuild, and restore strength. Yet their efforts, though brave, will never fully undo the consequences of this single quiet catastrophe. Fragile recovery and unfinished reforms. In the years after Manzikert, the Byzantine Empire felt as though it were breathing through a cracked reed, still alive, still fighting, but weakened in ways that were difficult to mend. Anatolia, once the empire's sturdy backbone, had splintered. Turkish clans spread gradually across the plateau, settling in valleys and on hilltops, where Byzantine soldiers once trained and farmers once tended olive groves. The familiar rhythms of provincial life faded, replaced by a shifting frontier whose boundaries were never quite certain. In Constantinople, the news from the east arrived in heavy, uneven waves. Some villages survived, others vanished. Fortresses remained loyal one season and fell the next. And the empire, shaken by political turmoil after Romanos IV's overthrow, struggled to find its footing. Emperors came and went quickly. Court factions whispered in marble corridors. The dynasty weakened. The great machine of empire, once steady and precise, began to grind unevenly. Yet, amid this uncertainty, a new family emerged, one with enough discipline, talent, and patience to recalibrate the empire's fate. Their name would echo across the next century, the Komnenoi. When Alexios the Komnenos ascended the throne in 1081, he inherited a realm battered by internal strife and external pressure. The Seljuks held much of Anatolia. Norman forces advanced in the west. Pechenegs threatened the Balkans. Venetian merchants demanded privileges, and the imperial treasury was nearly empty. Yet Alexios was calm, resourceful, and unshaken. He understood that recovery could not be achieved through force alone. It required careful balancing persuasion and new alliances. One of his first challenges came from the Normans led by the formidable Robert Guiscard, who landed in the Balkans with fierce ambition. Their armies pressed dangerously close to Thessaloniki. Under normal circumstances, the empire might have fought alone. But Alexios, recognizing the need for support, entered into negotiations with the Venetian Republic, granting them commercial rights in exchange for naval aid. Venetian ships soon filled the Aegean once more, helping drive the Normans back and restoring imperial control over the coastal regions. In Anatolia, Alexios faced an even greater challenge. He knew the empire could not reclaim the lost plateau with its own strength alone. Instead, he looked westward across the sea. His appeals to the Latin Christian world letters carried by envoys, wrapped in the language of shared faith and mutual danger, sparked a movement he did not anticipate the First Crusade. When Western knights began to arrive in 1096 and 1097, they came in waves, some disciplined, others unruly, all driven by a fervor unfamiliar to Byzantine sensibilities. The empire welcomed them with both hope and caution. Alexios guided their leaders through negotiations, gently reminding them that lands recovered from the Turks should be returned to Byzantine authority. And for a time this arrangement held. As crusading armies marched eastward, they pushed back the Seljuks and recaptured key cities, Nicaea, Antioch, and others. While the Crusaders continued to the Holy Land, Byzantium regained footholds along the western edge of Anatolia. For the first time in decades, the empire could breathe a little more steadily. But these gains came at a price. The Italians, especially the Venetians, demanded ever greater commercial concessions. Crusader leaders harbored suspicions about Byzantine motives. Cultural misunderstandings widened. The empire had made allies of necessity, but these alliances carried seeds of future conflict. Still, Alexios navigated these tensions with remarkable skill, strengthening the empire's internal structure while cautiously reclaiming lost lands. Within the empire, Alexios implemented reforms that helped stabilize the treasury. He reorganized taxation, curbed some abuses of the aristocracy, and restructured the military. Because the old thematic system no longer functioned as it once had, he relied increasingly on pronoia grants land revenues assigned to soldiers or officials in exchange for service. This created a new military class, one tied to the empire not by small farms, but by personal obligation and reward. Though effective in the short term, it altered the social fabric in ways that would echo later. When Alexios died, his son, John II Komnenos, stepped into the purple with a steady hand and a quiet nature. John was modest, devout, and methodical, an emperor who preferred action to ceremony. Under his leadership, the empire's slow recovery continued. He focused on Asia Minor, campaigning year after year to strengthen fortresses, secure frontiers, and restore Byzantine authority. His reign brought stability, though not dramatic expansion. He ruled with patience, understanding that true recovery required time. After John came Manuel Komnenos, a more flamboyant and ambitious ruler, restless, charismatic, drawn to the pageantry and contests of the Western world. Manuel admired Western knights, adopted some of their customs, and sought alliances with European kings. Under his rule, the empire became deeply entangled in the politics of Crusader states, Italian city-states, and Hungarian kingdoms. His armies marched across Anatolia, the Balkans, and even into Italy. His diplomacy was bold, but costly. Manuel's reign dazzled contemporaries. Banquets glittered with silver and silk. Foreign envoys described the brilliance of his court. Yet despite these displays, Byzantium's underlying vulnerabilities persisted. The economy, strained by constant military campaigns, needed rest. The aristocracy continued to gather influence. Anatolia, though partially restored, remained fragile. Even so, under the Komnenian emperors, Byzantium enjoyed something it had not felt in many years: confidence. Cities revived. Trade increased. The navy expanded. Art and architecture flourished. Constantinople regained a measure of its old splendor, its markets bustling with goods from 3 continents. At night, the lamps of the capital reflected softly on the waters of the Golden Horn, giving the city an air of serene endurance. But this recovery, though admirable, remained delicate. It depended heavily on strong emperors, on the particular brilliance, endurance, and judgment of the Komnenian family. It created no deep structural resilience, and when the dynasty began to weaken, the empire felt the tremors immediately. After Manuel's death, political turmoil tore through the capital. Factions aligned with rival heirs. Tax burdens increased. Foreign merchants, especially the Venetians and Genoese, gained alarming influence over trade as privileges granted in earlier decades grew impossible to revoke. Meanwhile, Seljuk and other Turkish principalities continued to strengthen in central Anatolia. A sense of quiet imbalance returned. The empire was stronger than it had been right after Manzikert, yet not strong enough to withstand the pressures gathering on its horizons. The Komnenian restoration was real but incomplete. It rebuilt the walls, but not the foundations. It revived the army, but not the old system that had once filled it with loyal soldier farmers. It restored wealth to the capital, but allowed that wealth to rest increasingly in the hands of foreign merchants and aristocrats. And so, even as the empire glided through moments of renewed glory, its future remained precarious. Twilight settles over Constantinople as this chapter of recovery draws to a close. The domes of the city glow softly beneath the evening sky. The harbors quiet their bustle. Priests extinguish their candles. And in the palace, the Comnenian emperors who held the empire together pass gently into memory. Ahead lies another turning point, one far more devastating than Manzikert. A blow not from Turks or Persians, but from those whom Byzantium once called allies. We approach the long road that leads to 1204, when the empire will face a calamity unlike any it had ever endured. The road to 1204. The 12th century drapes itself softly over Constantinople, a century of shimmering facades and hidden fractures. From the outside, the Byzantine Empire still appears formidable. Its palaces gleam with gold mosaics. Its churches resound with the deep, measured voices of choirs. Its harbors host ships from every corner of the Mediterranean. At night, the lights along the great palace shimmer across the waters of the Bosporus, as though the city were a radiant lantern suspended between continents. Yet beneath this glow, something quieter is unfolding, a slow unraveling, a widening gap between appearance and reality. Byzantium, recovering from earlier crises, seems strong on the surface, but the foundations beneath it have grown thin and strained. And as the empire navigates the 12th century, it moves almost unknowingly toward a catastrophe that will shatter its very heart. The death of Manuel Komnenos in 1180 marks the beginning of this fragile descent. Manuel's reign, though ambitious and costly, held the empire together through sheer energy and charisma. When he dies, his young son Alexios II inherits the throne. But the boy is too young to rule. The regency is unstable. Court factions whisper and scheme in the shadowed corridors of the great palace. Rival families press their claims. Loyalties blur. And into this vacuum steps a man whose actions will push the empire toward the brink, Andronikos Komnenos. Andronikos is brilliant, daring, and ruthless. He enters Constantinople like a storm, sweeping aside the regency, condemning rivals, and assuming control with fierce determination. For a brief moment, some even greet him as a reformer, believing he might restore order and curb the excesses of the aristocracy. But hope fades quickly. Andronikos's rule grows cruel, paranoid, and chaotic. Executions multiply. Families flee the capital. His harsh policies drive the aristocracy, already powerful after decades of privilege, into rebellion. The empire trembles, and before long Andronikos's enemies rise against him. Their revolt erupts in the capital with a violence rare even for Byzantine politics. Andronikos falls, dragged through the streets, his reign ending in turmoil. The empire, exhausted and fractured, now passes to a new dynasty, the Angelos emperors. But the Angeloi are weak rulers. Under them, the empire's precious resources are squandered. Corruption spreads through the court. Generals go unpaid. Fortresses lack supplies. Provincial governors act with increasing independence. Foreign merchants, Venetians, Genoese peasants expand their privileges until Byzantine control over its own economy begins to slip like sand through an open hand. The empire's once sophisticated administration now moves with sluggish uncertainty. Gold coins, once renowned for their purity, are debased. Tax revenues fall, armies shrink, and at the borders, enemies sense opportunity. In the west, the Normans of Sicily launch aggressive campaigns capturing Thessaloniki in 1185. Their troops move through the city with brutal efficiency. Citizens flee through alleys and side streets as churches burn. Though the Byzantines eventually reclaim the city, the shock lingers like a bruise. It reveals something that had long been whispered, but not yet spoken aloud. The empire is vulnerable. In the Balkans, a new power rises, the Second Bulgarian Empire, born from rebellion and nurtured by skillful leaders. They reclaim lands that had once formed the backbone of Byzantine strength. The empire, once dominant in the region, now finds itself on the defensive. In Anatolia, the Seljuk Turks remain firmly entrenched. The chance of regaining the plateau grows dimmer with each passing decade. Towns that once spoke Greek now speak Turkish. New principalities emerge. Old roads fade into dust. And yet, even amidst this slow decline, Constantinople shines. Its beauty masks its fragility. Foreign travelers marvel at its wealth. Its churches are filled with worshippers. Its libraries hold treasures of ancient knowledge. Its walls, massive and majestic, still stand unbroken. But beauty can mislead. It can comfort a weary empire into believing it has more time than it does. Meanwhile, far to the west, the papacy and Western European powers grow increasingly entangled in their own political ambitions. The Crusader movement, once directed toward the Holy Land, is becoming a complex web of economic interests, religious fervor, and strategic rivalry. Italian merchant cities, especially Venice, see the movement not only as a holy cause, but also as an opportunity to expand their influence over trade routes. A subtle tension has long lingered between Byzantium and the Western world: cultural differences, religious disputes, mutual suspicion. But now, those tensions begin to take shape in ways that will prove devastating. The Byzantine emperors attempt diplomacy, offering support to one faction or another, hoping to steer events in their favor. But their weakened position leaves them with little leverage. As the 13th century approaches, the empire enters a state of quiet disarray. Its rulers, desperate to maintain control, engage in half measures, temporary alliances, hurried concessions, and political gambles that lack coherence or vision. Constantinople remains glorious, but the provinces feel neglected. Soldiers grumble. Merchants question the wisdom of imperial decisions. Common people sense the shift in the air like sailors who detect a storm long before it appears on the horizon. Then in 1201, a new crusade is announced, the Fourth Crusade. Its leaders gather in Venice, seeking ships to carry them to Egypt or the Holy Land. But Venice has its own interests. The Crusaders owe the Republic a vast debt, far more than they can pay. And so the course of the crusade begins to drift, gently, then decisively, away from its declared goal. The Doge of Venice, old but still sharp, proposes a bargain: the debt may be forgiven if the Crusaders attack the city of Zara, an economic rival of Venice. The Crusaders agree. Zara falls and its walls crumble under the weight of a Christian army attacking fellow Christians. It is a troubling omen. Meanwhile, in Constantinople, members of the Angelus dynasty become entangled in the Crusaders' affairs. A young claimant, Alexios Angelos, promises riches and political cooperation if the Crusaders help him reclaim the throne from his uncle. The offer is tempting, especially to leaders in need of funds and direction. Thus, the fate of Byzantium becomes entangled not through grand strategy, but through a sequence of small decisions: debts, negotiations, and miscalculations, a prince's plea, a merchant republic's ambition, a crusade without a clear destination. The road to 1204 is not a single highway, but a network of narrow twisting paths, each one shaped by human motives, misunderstandings, and the quiet erosion of an empire's strength. No single moment makes the catastrophe inevitable. Rather, it grows slowly, like cracks spreading across marble until they suddenly break the stone. By the time the crusade turns its gaze toward Constantinople, the empire is too weak, too divided, and too exhausted to withstand what is coming. Even as lamps glow along the city's walls and monks chant in the deep halls of the Hagia Sophia, a sense of inevitability hangs in the air. A storm is approaching, one unlike the empire has ever faced. The storm reaches the city's gates. Constantinople will fall not to Persians or Arabs or Turks, but to an army that once marched under the sign of the cross. The fall of Constantinople. The first time. A cool spring wind ripples across the waters of the Golden Horn. It carries with it the scent of salt, distant fires, and the faint murmurs of a gathering storm. In the year 1204, Constantinople, the queen of cities, the jewel of the Eastern world, stands luminous as ever. Its domes shimmer beneath soft sunlight. Its markets hum with familiar rhythms. Bells ring from the great churches, drifting gently over the city's rooftops. To look upon it from afar, one would never guess that the empire is only days away from a calamity that will be remembered for centuries. Yet the signs are there, subtle but chilling, like the tremor of a candle flame before it extinguishes. Outside the city walls, encamped along the shores of the Bosporus and the Golden Horn, stands an army that was never meant to be here. Crusaders from the west, Franks, Flemings, Venetians, and knights from lands farther still have turned their campaign not toward Jerusalem or Egypt, but toward the very heart of Byzantium. Their banners flutter in the wind, marked with crosses that once symbolized a shared faith. Now those crosses cast long shadows upon the empire they prepare to breach. How did it come to this? The story begins with promise and debt, then drifts slowly into misunderstanding, disappointment, and resentment. The young claimant Alexios Angelos had begged the Crusaders for help, promising gold military support and obedience to Rome in exchange for the Byzantine throne. The Crusaders, deep in debt to Venice and unsure how else to continue their mission, accepted. When they helped Alexios seize the throne as Alexios IV, they expected fulfillment of every promise. But those promises were impossible. The Byzantine treasury could not supply the staggering sums demanded. The citizens of Constantinople rejected the new emperor's concessions to the west. Tension grew. Protests thickened. By 1203, the city was restive and hostile. And early in 1204, a coup swept Alexios IV from power. The Crusaders, suddenly without their patron and still unpaid, felt deceived. The Venetians saw opportunity, and the new Byzantine regime refused to negotiate with them. A chain of miscalculations, some arrogant, some desperate, some simply tragic, set the world's greatest Christian city on a collision path with a Christian army. Now, in April 1204, the moment has arrived. From the battlements, Byzantine defenders peer out over the water. They see ships, massive Venetian galleys, equipped with masts modified to support siege ladders. They see siege towers lashed to floating platforms. They see banners snapping in the breeze. And above all, they see thousands of determined soldiers preparing to storm the city. The defenders are weary. Their unity is uncertain. Yet the Theodosian walls, which have stood strong against Persians, Avars, Arabs, Rus, and Bulgars, remain firm ancient guardians carved from stone and history. The city's people believe or hope that these walls will hold once more. The first assault is met with resistance. Arrows arc across the sky. Stones crash against shields. Flames flicker along wooden beams drenched in pitch. The Crusaders retreat, only to return after brief respite. The Venetians' master shipbuilders adapt quickly. They draw closer to the sea walls, raising their ladders as high as engineering allows. The second assault begins. This time, the wind favors the attackers. The sails of Venetian ships fill. The vessels press close to the walls. Soldiers climb feverishly, their armor flashing in the sun. Defenders push them back, shouting over the roar of battle. For a moment it seems the walls will repel the invaders again, but fate turns on quiet details. A small gate along the seawall, normally locked, has been left unbarred in the confusion. Crusader soldiers discover it. They force it open. A handful slip through. Then more. Byzantine defenders fall back surprised and fragmented, and on the landward side, another ladder finds purchase. A few attackers climb, gaining a foothold atop the battlements. Once the wall is breached, even in two small places, momentum shifts. Crusaders surge forward. Byzantine lines waver. Rumors spread that sections of the city have fallen. Panic spreads through neighborhoods near the walls. The defenders, already strained by political division and lack of supplies, begin to lose cohesion. By evening, the impossible becomes real. Constantinople is taken. The city that had defied armies for 8 centuries, that had withstood sieges by Saracens, Persians, Bulgars, and Rus, now falls not with the thunder of catapults, but with the weary sigh of internal weakness and misfortune. What follows is devastation, not described here in harsh detail, but in the soft tone history sometimes adopts when recounting tragedies too sorrowful to confront directly. Churches are entered by those who do not understand their sanctity. Palaces once filled with incense and candlelight are ransacked. Libraries that preserved the wisdom of ancient ages lose precious manuscripts. Families flee through the narrow streets, seeking refuge in pockets of calm. The city's treasured icons, some centuries old, are confiscated or destroyed. Priceless objects, gifts of emperors, offerings of saints, vanish into the chaos. For 3 days, Constantinople endures what no city of its stature, no city of its beauty, should ever endure. The sounds of sorrow mingle with the crackling of fires and the clamor of looting. The Queen of Cities, once serene and radiant, becomes a place of fear. Yet even in tragedy, the city spirit endures. A few monasteries remain untouched, their monks gathered in prayer. Some defenders continue to hold small corners of the walls, refusing to surrender until the final moment. And the people, though, broken, watch with quiet resilience as the storm passes. When the Crusaders finally establish order, they impose a new political structure, the Latin Empire of Constantinople. Venetian interests dominate. Western nobles divide the city and the surrounding lands. A Latin patriarch replaces the Orthodox one. Many Byzantines flee to distant provinces, Nicaea, Trebizond, and Epirus, where they form successor states desperate to preserve pieces of their old world. But something profound has changed. The Byzantine Empire, guardian of Roman law, heir to the Christian East, preserver of ancient knowledge, has been shattered. Its administrative heart has been torn apart, its wealth has been seized, its morale has been wounded. Even the symbolic center of its identity, Constantinople, is no longer its own. This first fall is not the end of Byzantium, but it is a wound from which the empire will never fully recover. Though the city will be retaken in 1261, the structures that once supported a world-spanning empire will remain broken. Its territories will be smaller, its treasury thinner, its diplomacy weaker, its place in the world irrevocably altered. As the fires of 1204 burn low and the Crusaders settle uneasily into their conquered city, night spreads slowly across the Bosporus. The waters reflect a sky that seems dimmer than before, and the wind, once carrying the scent of spices and distant orchards, now carries only the heavy quiet of loss. We follow the empire's twilight centuries, its brave attempts at revival, its shrinking borders, and the long patient shadow of the rising Ottoman world. The last Byzantine's night has fallen softly over the Bosporus, its dark waters shimmering beneath a scatter of lamps from distant shores. The great city of Constantinople, once unrivaled in wealth and splendor, now lies quiet, diminished, but still breathing. It is the year 1261, and after nearly 6 decades under Latin rule, Byzantine banners rise again above the ancient walls. The city has returned to its people. But the Constantinople that Michael the Palaiologos re-enters is not the Constantinople his ancestors knew. Streets that once glowed with commerce feel thin and worn. Palaces lie in ruins. Churches stand emptied of treasures taken westward. The hippodrome is silent. Entire quarters of the city are abandoned, reclaimed by wind and stray animals. The empire has regained its heart, but that heart now beats faintly. Reconstruction begins immediately. Michael VIII moves to restore the Hagia Sophia, to refill the treasury, to revive administration. Craftsmen rebuild walls and gates, patching scars left by fire and neglect. Monks return to their monasteries. Merchants reopen their stalls. And slowly, as years pass, Constantinople regains a measure of its old dignity. But the Byzantines know the truth that lingers like a shadow at dawn. The empire that emerges from 1204 is not the same one that entered it. The Palaiologan Empire, the final chapter of Byzantine history, is a realm of weary endurance. Its borders have shrunk dramatically. Anatolia, once the fertile heartland, remains largely under Turkish control. In the Balkans, Serbia, Bulgaria, and other rising powers challenge Byzantine influence. The Italian maritime republics Venice and Genoa hold significant sway over Mediterranean trade. Their privileges, granted piecemeal over past decades, now give them control of harbors, customs, and shipping lanes. The empire feels like a guest in its own maritime world. Economically, Byzantium struggles. The wealth that once flowed through Constantinople's markets now trickles more slowly. The countryside cannot support the same armies it once did. Taxes are difficult to collect, and the treasury fluctuates between austerity and desperation. The imperial mint, once famed for its pure gold coinage issues, debased coins that reflect the precarious reality of the state. And yet, despite all this, the city persists with quiet resilience, its people carrying on with work, prayer, and hope. Culturally, the empire blooms even in its fragility. The late Byzantine period witnesses a renaissance of art, philosophy, and theology. Scholars gather in dimly lit chambers to discuss ancient Greek texts. Monks copy manuscripts with renewed devotion. Painters develop new iconographic styles, softer, more contemplative, deeply spiritual. The Palaiologan Renaissance, though born in an age of decline, becomes a final flowering of Byzantine brilliance. But outside the walls, a new force rises in the east, one that will cast a long shadow across the final centuries of Byzantium. Small at first, like a distant campfire on the horizon, the Ottoman Beylik begins as one of many Turkish principalities in northwestern Anatolia. Under the leadership of Osman and later his successors, the Ottomans grow steadily, absorbing neighboring lands through diplomacy, conquest, and strategic marriage. Their warriors move swiftly, and their leaders possess a clarity of purpose that many older states lack. By the 14th century, Ottoman forces cross into Europe. They seize fortresses in Thrace. They establish footholds along the Maritsa River. Byzantine emperors, caught between rivals in the Balkans and enemies in Anatolia, struggle to respond. Diplomacy becomes their primary tool. Treaties with Serbia, appeals to the West, even alliances with rival Turkish states. And at moments they succeed in delaying the Ottoman advance. But the balance has changed. Byzantium is no longer shaping events, it is reacting to them, often hesitantly, often too late. The empire's internal struggles deepen the crisis. Court factions vie for influence. Civil wars erupt most disastrously in the mid-14th century, when John V Palaiologos and John VI Kantakouzenos wage a conflict that invites foreign intervention at every turn. Genoa supports one side, Venice supports another. The Ottomans, carefully watching from across the straits, enter the war under the guise of allies, establishing permanent bases in Europe as compensation. When the civil war ends, Byzantium emerges exhausted. Its population has declined. Its provinces are ravaged. Its finances are in ruins. And the Ottomans now stand firmly entrenched in Thrace, only a short ride from the capital's land walls. Still, Constantinople endures. Its walls remain mighty. Its churches echo with ancient hymns. Its scholars continue their work, preserving the intellectual heritage of Greece and Rome. And its emperors, though weary, maintain a quiet dignity as they navigate a world that has grown increasingly complex and hostile. By the late 14th century, the empire has become little more than a city-state with pockets of territory scattered along coasts and islands. But even then, hope flickers. For a time, the Ottoman advance slows. Timur's invasion of Anatolia in 1402 disrupts Ottoman unity. Constantinople experiences a brief reprieve. Emperor Manuel II Palaiologos travels across Europe appealing for aid. He speaks with kings, princes, and the Pope politely, eloquently, as though appealing to an old friend's better nature. He returns with sympathy, but little action. As the 15th century unfolds, the Ottomans recover their strength more rapidly than Byzantium can rebuild its defenses. Under sultans like Murad II, and later the young and determined Mehmed II, their armies grow disciplined and formidable. Their cannons, products of a new age, are capable of shaking walls once thought unbreakable. In Constantinople, the final generation of Byzantines carries on with a kind of luminous melancholy. They attend liturgy in the Hagia Sophia, listening to chants that have survived wars, invasions, and centuries of change. They walk the old markets where only a few stalls remain, recalling the bustling days of merchants from 3 continents. Scholars gather in quiet rooms, continuing to debate philosophy and theology, even as the empire's territory dwindles around them. These last centuries have a gentle sadness to them, like the dimming light of evening across a once great landscape. The empire is no longer a mighty power. It is a keeper of memory, a custodian of knowledge, a remnant of a world that once shaped continents. And yet there is dignity in this endurance. The Byzantines do not abandon their city. They do not relinquish their traditions. They continue to write, to paint, to worship, to teach. Even as the horizon darkens with the approach of a formidable new empire, the old one maintains its quiet, unwavering heartbeat. As we stand with them in these final pages of Byzantine history, We sense the steady passage of time. Empires rise, decline, and fall. But the people who inhabit them who live, trade worship, and hope, carry their stories forward in soft, enduring echoes. The final chapter unfolds the last siege, the fall of Constantinople in 1453, and the legacy that outlives the empire itself. Echoes, after the walls. Fell dawn breaks gently over the Bosporus, pale and uncertain, as though the sun itself hesitates before rising on the final morning of an ancient world. The year is 1453, and Constantinople, once radiant, once powerful, once the envy of empires, now stands as a tired sentinel of ages long past. Its land walls, still imposing after 1,000 years, appear weathered. Its harbors hold only a few ships. Its population, once in the hundreds of thousands, has dwindled to a small fraction, and yet the city endures. The final emperor, Constantine V Palaiologos, wakes in the pre-dawn stillness. Outside his window, the air is cool, filled with the faint smells of earth and sea. He knows what this day may bring. The Ottoman army, led by the determined young Sultan Mehmed II, surrounds the city in a ring of steel and fire. Cannons rumble through the night. Torches flicker like distant stars in the enemy camps. The siege has lasted weeks, but centuries of history weigh upon this morning. Still, Constantinople is calm. If you walk the streets quietly before sunrise, you might hear the soft murmur of prayer behind the doors of humble homes. You might hear the distant chanting of monks in small chapels tucked between ruined houses. You might see the city's last defenders tightening straps on worn armor, sharpening blades that have been passed through generations, or whispering words of hope to one another. In the heart of the city, the Hagia Sophia glows with candlelight. Once the grandest church in Christendom, it now holds citizens seeking comfort and protection. Families gather beneath its wide dome. Priests move with gentle steps, offering blessings. The air is warm with incense, rich with memory. Here Byzantines pray not only for victory, but for peace, whatever form it may take. Outside the walls, the Ottoman cannons roar awake with the rising sun. Their thunder shakes the earth and echoes across the sea. Stones crash against the ancient battlements, sending dust drifting through the cool air. The final siege of Constantinople has begun. Yet even in this moment of violence, the city remains strangely serene. Time seems to slow. The defenders, vastly outnumbered, push back scaling ladders, douse fires, and brace weakened sections of the wall. They fight not with desperation, but with a quiet, steady resolve. They know they are guarding the last breath of something ancient, something sacred, a civilization that has shaped the world for more than a millennium. Constantine V rides along the walls, encouraging his soldiers with calm words. He wears no crown today. He is an emperor, yes, but he is also a guardian of the city and its people. Those who see him in these final hours will remember his composure, the way he seems less like a ruler and more like a shepherd, guiding a weary flock through twilight. By mid-morning, the Ottoman assault intensifies. Waves of soldiers surge against the walls. The great cannon basilica, as contemporaries call it, belches fire. The earth shudders. Sections of the fortifications begin to crumble. Still, the defenders resist. They rally at each breach, holding the line with remarkable courage, but courage alone cannot turn the tide. A small gate, damaged and poorly held, becomes the point where destiny shifts. Ottoman soldiers force their way inside. Confusion follows, voices raised, commands, shouted, dust swirling in the air. Constantine V, seeing that the walls are lost, joins the final defense. He disappears into the crush of men, and his fate becomes part of the city's memory, forever mingled with the stone and sea and sky of that final day. By afternoon the sounds of battle soften. Ottoman banners rise where Byzantine standards once flew. The city, exhausted, beyond measure yields. Constantinople has fallen. But its story does not end in grief. Instead, something quieter unfolds. As the storm of conquest settles, Mehmed II walks through the breached gates. He is young, ambitious, thoughtful. And though victorious, he pauses before the shattered walls, taking in the weight of the moment. Inside the city, he visits the Hagia Sophia. He does not raze it. He does not desecrate it. Instead, he orders its preservation. He commands that it be transformed into a mosque, a living monument protected and revered. In doing so, he ensures that the Great Dome will continue to shelter prayers for centuries to come. Under Ottoman rule, Constantinople becomes Istanbul, a vibrant capital of a new empire. Its streets fill again with merchants and artisans. Its markets awaken. Its skyline grows with new buildings, new domes, new minarets. The city transforms, but it does not vanish. Byzantine foundations remain beneath the stone, beneath the memory, beneath the enduring hum of life. And what of Byzantium itself, the empire that had survived for more than 1,000 years? It too endures not as a political state, but as a lingering echo across the world. Byzantine law influences future legal systems. Byzantine theology shapes the Orthodox Christian tradition, stretching across Eastern Europe and into Russia. Byzantine art, its icons, mosaics, hymns, continues to move hearts with its deep contemplative beauty. Even the manuscripts preserved by Byzantine scholars help spark new learning in the West, contributing to the Renaissance. Empires fall, but their echoes persist. Imagine standing now centuries later along the shore, where the old sea walls met the waves. The breeze is gentle. Ships glide across the water. The city before you is vast, modern, ancient, layered. Its avenues hum with life. Yet if you listen closely, very closely, you might still hear faint traces of the old world, the footsteps of emperors walking marble halls, the chants of monks beneath candlelit ceilings, the distant ringing of the bells of the Hagia Sophia. In these echoes, Byzantium survives, and so as this long journey draws to a close, let us look once more toward the Bosporus. The sun is setting now, slipping quietly behind the hills of the old city. The sky glows with soft pink and amber light. The water reflects the colors in slow-moving ripples. Time stretches gently across the horizon. The Byzantine Empire lasted more than 1,000 years. It rose from Rome's eastern provinces. It survived invasion, plague, schism, and catastrophe. It created art of shimmering beauty. It preserved knowledge that might otherwise have been lost. It shaped cultures and religions across continents. And even in its decline, it carried itself with solemn grace. Its fall was not a single moment, but a long twilight melancholy, dignified, filled with both loss and luminous endurance. Now as you rest in the quiet of this final chapter, imagine the lights of ancient Constantinople flickering in the distance. Imagine the faint echo of waves against old stone. Imagine the gentle passing of centuries, each one carrying memories forward in soft whispers. History moves on, cities change, empires fade, but their stories remain ever drifting like a lullaby across the currents of time. And with that, the tale of Byzantium gently comes to rest.